So I want you to imagine this really sophisticated, enlightened civilization, like one that had completely mapped the stars, built these incredible aqueducts, and had this rich culture of rational philosophy.
Right.
And then imagine that entire civilization just being brutally dismantled, like torn apart by these black-robed, anti-intellectual fanatics who are basically armed with iron bars and this iron sense of righteousness.
It sounds like something straight out of a dystopian sci-fi novel, honestly.
It really does. But we aren't talking about fiction here. We are actually talking about the transition from the classical Roman world to the Christianized Roman Empire, or at least, that is the explosive blockbuster premise of a widely celebrated book that has kind of completely upended how a lot of people view late antiquity.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive shift in perspective.
Yeah, so today we are jumping right into this massive historical collision. We're going to do a deep dive looking at how history is written, how we, consume it as a society, and how fiercely it gets contested.
And it is just a phenomenal case study in historiography. I mean, our desk is completely piled high today with sources.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot to get through.
We really do. So the centerpiece of our deep dive today is Catherine Nixey's 2017 international bestseller. It's called The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World.
Right. And
we are looking at summaries, excerpts, and the critical reception of her work, pulling data from places like Wikipedia and bookmarks. But, to get the full picture of this debate, we aren't just looking at the book itself.
No, we have to look at pushback.
Exactly. We are weighing Nixey's claims against a deeply critical, 12,000-word dissection of her book by Tim O'Neill.
That's a long review.
It is dense. It was published on his blog, History for Atheists. And O'Neill brings in this absolute mountain of archaeological data and specialist historiography to basically challenge almost every major pillar of Nixey's narrative.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds of, smashed statues and burned libraries and all that, we really need to lay down a clear framework for you, the listener.
Yeah, that's crucial here.
Because the sources we are unpacking today contain some incredibly highly charged debates. We're talking about religion, violence, and literally the foundation of Western civilization.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy. So our goal here is absolutely not to take a side.
Right.
Or to endorse either the pro-Christian or anti-Christian viewpoints that are embedded in these texts. We are just here to dismantle the arguments impartially.
Just looking at the mechanics of the debate.
Exactly. We want to show you the evidence Nixey uses to build her case, and then the counter-evidence her critics deploy to tear it down. And really, just look at the underlying anatomy of how a historical narrative goes mainstream.
And to understand why the Darkening Age hit the public consciousness like a freight train, we really have to look at the sheer force of Nixey's central thesis.
It's not subtle.
No, not at all. She argues that early Christians didn't just, passively inherit the Roman Empire as it naturally declined. She says they deliberately and violently destroyed classical Greek and Roman culture. In her framing, they essentially plunged an enlightened world into deliberate intellectual darkness.
And the imagery she uses in the source material is just incredibly visceral. I mean, she isn't just talking about shifting demographics or quiet policy changes.
Oh, no.
She describes Christians actively mutilating ancient statues, like physically hacking the faces and genitals off the Parthenon's decorations.
Yeah, the visual language is intense.
It really is. She paints this picture of zealots burning vast libraries of classical wisdom, forcibly closing philosophical schools that had operated for centuries, and even, murdering intellectuals right in the street.
It is a narrative of absolute uncompromising annihilation. She makes the case that the intellectual achievements of antiquity were just suffocated by this wave of dogmatic religious zealotry.
And people ate it up. I mean, the public and critical response from mainstream publications was staggering.
It was huge.
I was looking at the accolades, and it was a genuine phenomenon. It was a New York Times notable book, translated into 12 languages.
Wow.
Yeah, and it won the Morris D. Forkosh Book Award for the Best Humanist Book and a Jerwood Award for nonfiction. Prominent philosopher A.C. Grayling actually called it his favorite book of the year.
That is some serious praise.
Right, and the historian Bettany Hughes wrote this rave review calling it a beliftable of a book. Gerard de Groot in the Times praised it for challenging, quote, comfortable assumptions about Christian progress.
Which is very telling.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
I think de Groot's comment is really the key to why you, or really anyone else, might find this book so compelling. because Nixie is essentially executing a massive heel turn on the traditional Sunday school narrative.
Ah, the professional wrestling analogy works perfectly here.
Right, because you grow up with this cultural narrative that the early Christians were the ultimate good guys.
Right. Peaceful, loving martyrs.
Exactly. Hiding in the catacombs, running from these oppressive, decadent Roman emperors. And Nixie comes along and completely flips the script.
She reverses the roles.
Totally.
Yeah.
She says the supposed good guys were actually the villains, and the Roman pagans were the enlightened, pluralistic victims. It is such an irresistible, counterintuitive hook.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this, because reading through Tim O'Neill's incredibly dense counterarguments, I kept getting stuck on a massive logical pothole.
Oh, I know exactly which one you mean.
If this Christian destruction of the classical world was as absolute and total as Nixie claims it was, how do we even have the classical history to study today?
Right.
Like, how does Nixie have copies of Ovid or Aristotle to quote from if the Christians supposedly eradicated them all?
What's fascinating here is that logical pothole is exactly what specialist historians point to, and it stems from Nixie leaning entirely on something called the conflict thesis.
The conflict thesis. What is that exactly?
So this is a historiographical concept that got really popular in the 19th century. It basically argues that science and religion, or in this specific case, classical rational philosophy and Christian dogma, are locked in an inherent perpetual war.
Like they can't coexist.
Exactly. It treats history as a zero-sum game. One side wins, the other side has to be completely destroyed.
So to make that conflict thesis work, you kind of have to curate the history to fit that binary, don't you?
Precisely. And while Nixie writes incredibly gripping prose, O'Neill and other specialist historians argue she sustains this entire narrative through highly selective evidence.
She's cherry picking.
Yes. O'Neill's critique points out that she relies heavily on 18th century anti-clerical polemicists. So most notably, she leans on Edward Gibbon.
Right, the author of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
That's the one.
Okay, we need to unpack Gibbon for a second, because I don't think we can really judge O'Neill's critique without understanding why Gibbon is such a problematic primary source for this.
Definitely.
Gibbon wasn't just some objective observer, right? He was an Enlightenment thinker writing in the 1770s.
Yes, and he had a massive philosophical axe to grind against the church.
Exactly. He actively wanted to prove that the Roman Empire fell specifically because it embraced Christian pacifism and superstition instead of, classical martial virtue.
He had a predetermined conclusion.
Right. So if you build your modern history book on an 18th century writer who already had a blatant anti-religious agenda, you are basically laundering his biases into the modern day.
And that is the absolute core of O'Neill's methodological critique. By relying on Enlightenment writers rather than engaging fully with, modern, nuanced archaeological data, Nixie constructs a fable.
The good guys versus bad guys fable.
Exactly. And to make a fable work, you need perfect heroes and perfect villains, which means she has to dramatically elevate the pre-Christian Romans to make their fall feel like this profound, tragic loss for humanity.
Which sets the stage perfectly for her argument. Let's look at how she actually contrasts the two sides before this supposed Dark Age begins.
Let's do it.
She portrays the pre-Christian Romans as urbane, deeply tolerant, and virtually pluralistic. According to her summaries, the Romans didn't really care what you believed in your heart of hearts. They enforced orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy.
Yes, so orthopraxy being proper actions and orthodoxy being proper beliefs.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the Roman state was fundamentally pragmatic. They didn't really care if you secretly despised the emperor, as long as you publicly burn a little pinch of incense to his genius to demonstrate your civic loyalty.
It was like checking a box.
Exactly. It was a political loyalty oath that was just draped in the trappings of a religious ritual.
So Nixie frames Roman governors as these highly educated, reasonable administrators who are just, trying to keep the aqueducts running and keep the peace.
Right.
And then they are confronted with these early Christians who stubbornly refuse to perform this tiny, seemingly meaningless civic ritual of just burning some incense.
It baffled them.
Yeah, Nixie portrays the Roman officials as finding the Christians less of an existential threat and more just vaguely annoying.
And she leans heavily on the famous correspondence between Pliny the Younger, who was the governor of Bithynia, and the Emperor Trajan.
Right, the letters.
Yeah. Pliny writes to Trajan asking for bureaucratic advice on how to handle the Christians. And he doesn't sound bloodthirsty at all. He basically wants to know the absolute minimum number of people he has to execute to maintain public order.
Just doing his job.
Right. And Nixie uses this to argue for Roman restraint.
She even implies that the Christians were volunteering for martyrdom.
Yeah.
Almost, forcing the Romans' hands.
So she definitely plays that angle up.
Yeah, the sources cite this Roman prefect who is literally trying to bribe a Christian named Julius to just walk away and avoid execution.
Just take the out.
Right. But Julius refuses, he calls it the money of Satan, until the prefect finally gives up and is like, well, I have to behead you now for disrespecting the imperial decrees.
He had no choice.
Exactly. Nixie wants the reader to feel sympathy for the exasperated Roman executioner, which is wild. And to bolster this image of a peaceful Roman state, she aggressively minimizes the number of Christians who were actually persecuted.
She really downplays the numbers.
She quotes Henry Dodwell from all the way back in 1684 and Edward Gibbon to suggest there were fewer than 13 years of imperially ordered persecution total.
Wow.
And that it resulted in perhaps only hundreds of victims across 3 entire centuries.
But here's where O'Neill's critique brings the hammer down on this framing of Roman tolerance. He points out that Roman tolerance had brutally straight limits.
Oh, I'm sure.
And it was entirely 100% contingent on conformity.
I mean, let's think about that. So what does this all mean? If tolerance means you can do whatever you want, as long as it is exactly what the emperor commands you to do, is that really tolerance?
Not by any modern definition, no.
It sounds like saying a restaurant has an incredibly diverse menu, provided you only ever order the chicken.
That is exactly it. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the ancient world to apply modern liberal concepts of religious freedom to Rome. They did not have that.
Right.
O'Neill's sources push back hard by highlighting how the Romans treated literally any group that violated their specific parameters of acceptable religion. The Celtic Druids in Gaul and Britain are a really prime example of this.
What happened to them?
The Romans completely annihilated them.
Because they were practicing human sacrifice, right?
Well, yes, that was the moral justification they used. Because human sacrifice offended Roman sensibilities. But the actual political mechanism behind the violence was that the Druids served as a focal point for Celtic rebellion against Roman rule.
So it was political.
Exactly. The Romans didn't shrug and say, well, we were a pluralistic society, so we must tolerate the Druids and their practices. No, they sent the legions in and wiped them off the map.
And O'Neill also brings up the Bacchanalian sect, right?
Yeah.
In 86 BC, which is centuries before Jesus was even born, the Roman Senate decided this cult of Bacchus was too foreign, too secretive, and that it basically undermined Roman social norms.
They didn't like the secrecy.
At all.
Yeah.
And they didn't debate them in the forum or write them angry letters. They arrested thousands of them and executed a massive number of them. That completely shatters the image of this urbane live and let live society.
It does, because what the Romans actually had was a concept called religio licita.
Religio licita.
Right, which means allowed religion. To the Roman mind, antiquity equaled validity. If a religion was old, it was respectable. And this is exactly why they tolerated the Jews.
Okay, that makes sense.
The Romans found Jewish monotheism and their dietary laws completely baffling. I mean, the historian Tacitus wrote with just visceral disgust about Jewish practices. He actually called them sinister and revolting.
Yikes.
But because Judaism was an ancient ancestral faith, the Romans carved out exceptions for them, provided they didn't rebel, of course.
But Christianity broke that rule. It wasn't ancient.
Exactly. To the Romans, Christianity was a novel superstition. And in the Roman political vocabulary, new meant dangerous.
It was a threat.
Yes. It was spreading rapidly, particularly among the lower classes, slaves, and women, and it aggressively rejected the civic rituals that bound the empire together. Therefore, the Roman state perceived it as a direct structural threat to their social cohesion.
And O'Neill catches Nixie playing fast and loose with the death tolls to maintain her whole reasonable Roman narrative.
She definitely massages the numbers.
She cites a historian named W.H.C. Friend to claim the martyrs numbered hundreds, not thousands. But O'Neill actually goes and checks the citation.
Always check the citations.
Always. And it turns out Friend was only estimating the death toll for one specific, highly localized persecution under the Emperor Decius.
Right.
When it came to the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian, Friend explicitly estimated 3,000 to 3,500 victims. And Nixie just entirely omits the Diocletian numbers.
Which is what moves her work from being history into being a polemic. Diocletian's persecution wasn't just some localized bureaucratic misunderstanding.
No.
It was a massive, systematic, empire-wide campaign to crush a religious minority through imprisonment, torture, and execution. By downplaying this, Nixie obscures the crucial context of why early Christians might have harbored intense hostility toward the physical symbols of the Roman state once they finally got power.
Right, because if you just omit the trauma of the Great Persecution, the later Christian actions just look like completely unprovoked vandalism.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the core visual of Nixie's book, the titular Darkening Age. If the Romans weren't peaceful pluralists, what about her central claim that Christians were these widespread destroyers of art and architecture?
Well, the image Nixie evokes is definitely unforgettable. She describes the Roman Empire overrun by these black-robed zealots roaming the countryside, armed with what she calls primitive ladders and hammers.
There's a ladder.
Yeah, and systematically smashing beautiful classical statues because they were, in her words, too stupid to appreciate them.
She actually claims that the only reason certain statues survive today is because these Christian mobs were literally too technologically inept to figure out how to reach the ones placed high up on temple facades.
It's a very sweeping claim. And to support this idea of programmatic destruction, Nixie cites Jewish tractates, specifically a text from the Mishnah called the Avodah Zarah.
Okay, what does that text say?
So this text details the desecration of idols. It notes how cutting off the tip of an idol's nose or an ear renders it legally desecrated. And Nixie uses this to explain why so many classical statues surviving today are missing noses and limbs.
She implies the Christians used it as a guide.
Exactly, implying this Jewish text functioned as an instruction manual for Christian vandals.
But O'Neill tears this specific claim completely apart. I mean, the Avodah Zarah is a Jewish legal text written by Jews, for Jews, on how to coexist in a society full of idol worshippers without violating their own laws.
Right, it's about commerce.
Yeah. It's essentially a guide on whether a Jewish merchant can trade an item that might have once been used in a pagan ritual. Suggesting that angry mobs of illiterate Christian peasants were consulting complex Jewish legal texts for instructions on how to vandalize a statue is it's wildly ahistorical.
It fundamentally misrepresents the source material. But O'Neill doesn't just stop at textual critique here. He brings in hard archaeological data.
The receipts.
Yes. He cites a massive, comprehensive survey of late antique archaeology edited by experts Luc Levan and Michael Morian. And look, if Nixie's thesis of an empire-wide orgy of destruction were accurate, the archaeological stratigraphy would be painfully obvious.
We would see it in the dirt.
Exactly. We would see a distinct layer of violently smashed temples, burned sanctuaries, and crushed statuary all across the Mediterranean basin.
So what did the archaeologists actually find when they surveyed, thousands of these temple sites?
Out of thousands of surveyed sites across the entire former empire, archaeologists found only 43 cases of confirmed desecration.
43.
Yes. And when it comes to active, violent architectural destruction of a temple, they found a mere 4 confirmed cases.
Wait, let me make sure I'm hearing that correctly. 4.
4!
Out of thousands of temples, they can only archaeologically prove 4 were violently destroyed.
4 archaeologically confirmed cases. And the regional breakdown is really telling here. In Gaul, only 2.4% of known temples show any evidence of violent destruction. There is only 1 confirmed example in all of Asia Minor, 7 in Egypt.
Wow.
The only place you could really call a hotspot for temple destruction was the Levant, which accounts for half of all known cases. So Nixie basically takes a localized regional anomaly in the Levant and scales it up to describe the entire Roman Empire.
That's a huge leap. And O'Neill is pretty ruthless in his pushback regarding her claim about the primitive ladders, too.
Oh, that part is great.
He points out the absurdity of claiming that Christians were too stupid to figure out a ladder, considering these are the exact same Christians who engineered and built the massive 55-meter-high dome of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Right. Did they build one of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world using primitive hammers?
It completely exposes the rhetorical exaggeration. But, it raises a valid question. If angry Christian mobs didn't destroy these thousands of temples, why are they ruins today? What happened to them?
I was trying to map this onto a modern equivalent, and the best analogy I can think of is the phenomenon of abandoned shopping malls.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, you see these massive, decaying concrete structures from the 1980s that look completely post-apocalyptic today.
Yeah, they look like ruins.
Exactly. But they weren't destroyed by anti-capitalist zealots with sledgehammers. They just fell into ruin because the economic reality shifted. The foot traffic moved online, the anchor stores pulled out, and the massive funding required to keep the lights on, and the security paid, and the roof repaired, it just simply dried up.
The culture just moved on.
The culture moved on.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that analogy perfectly captures the structural mechanics of late antiquity. Religion in the Roman world was undergoing a profound economic and cultural shift centuries before Christianity became the state religion.
It wasn't a sudden event.
Not at all. We have to look at the economics of paganism. Classical state-sponsored cults revolved around animal sacrifice at massive temple complexes.
And that is incredibly expensive.
Extremely expensive. It wasn't just, bringing a goat to an altar in the woods. It was a massive elite economic engine. You had to purchase unblemished oxen. You had to pay the specialized priests, the butchers, the augurs who actually read the entrails.
Lots of overhead.
Massive overhead. The incense trade alone required vast sums of money flowing to the east. And then there was the subsequent feast, where social status was rigidly enforced by who got the best cuts of meat. It was a top-down expression of wealth and piety that the vast majority of the regular population simply couldn't participate in.
So long before Christianity takes over, regular people were already pivoting to cheaper, more personal forms of devotion.
Right.
Like leaving a small votive offering at a local shrine instead of buying a whole bowl.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the lower classes either. The intellectual elite were also shifting away from this. Prominent pagan philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry were already arguing that blood sacrifice was a primitive, messy, and spiritually unnecessary practice.
They were over it.
Yeah, Plotinus famously refused an invitation to a temple sacrifice by declaring, quote, "The gods ought come to me, not I to them."
Wow. So the cultural foot traffic was already abandoning the mall, so to speak.
Yes. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, the elite imperial funding for pagan temples began to dry up. And without that massive influx of state money, these incredibly expensive temple complexes just couldn't be maintained.
The business model failed.
The priests couldn't be paid, they simply closed their doors, they sat abandoned for generations, roofs caving in, eventually being dismantled by locals who just needed pre-cut stone to build houses or local churches.
O'Neill highlights this darkly comedic story about the Emperor Julian the Apostate that illustrates this perfectly.
I love this story.
So Julian comes to power in the 360s AD, and he tries to single-handedly revive paganism. He goes to the famous sacred grove of Apollo at Antioch, expecting this massive, glorious pagan festival.
Right, he's the emperor.
He's expecting choruses, clouds of incense, and literally hundreds of beasts lined up for sacrifice.
And what actually happens when the emperor arrives?
He finds exactly one old priest who had brought a single goose from his own backyard to sacrifice.
A single goose.
The entire city of Antioch hadn't bothered to prepare anything else. The enthusiasm was just entirely gone. The local elite had already shifted their economic patronage elsewhere. So the temple wasn't violently destroyed by Christians. It basically died of sheer apathy.
That anecdote is the perfect encapsulation of the slow, natural death of classical temple religion. However, to be fair to Nixie, while her claim of empire-wide apocalyptic destruction isn't supported by the archaeology, late antiquity was an incredibly violent era.
Oh, for sure.
There were specific, brutal events, and Nixie builds her narrative around two very famous set pieces in the city of Alexandria.
Right.
The destruction of the Serapium temple and the murder of the philosopher Hypatia.
Okay, let's look at how Nixie frames the Serapium. She describes this temple as one of the most beautiful buildings in the ancient world, and crucially, she claims it housed a massive library of classical texts.
The famous library.
In her book, One Day in 392 AD, a spontaneous crowd of Christian vandals masses outside the temple and violently destroys it. She caps off the tragedy by quoting Edward Gibbon again, who laments the, quote, empty shelves that excited the regret of every spectator. It's framed as this unprovoked act of cultural vandalism against a library.
But O'Neill pulls the historical context back into focus, and it reveals a massive, glaring omission on her part. According to multiple ancient sources, and crucially this includes both Christian and pagan contemporary writers, the destruction of the Serapeum was not a spontaneous riot.
Right.
It was the culmination of a military siege against a gang of hostage-takers.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, a military siege? Nixie leaves out a hostage situation.
Entirely.
That completely changes the dynamic. It's like reporting on a SWAT team, raiding a bank building, describing the property damage in detail, but completely omitting the fact that there were heavily armed bank robbers inside executing hostages.
It is an egregious omission. A faction of radical pagan Neoplatonist extremists, led by a philosopher named Olympius, had actively seized the Serapium, which was a massive, highly defensible structure, and basically turned it into a fortified citadel.
A fortress?
Yes, and from this fortress they were conducting terror operations across Alexandria.
O'Neill details the torture they were inflicting. They were sallying out, capturing Christians, dragging them back into the temple, and forcing them to sacrifice to the pagan gods.
Under threat of torture.
Yeah, if they refused, they were brutally tortured, their legs were broken, they were crucified and thrown into the deep trenches that were used for the blood of animal sacrifices. There's a specific mention of a prominent Christian rhetorician named Gessius who was starved, crucified, and thrown into a pit by these pagan extremists.
So the spontaneous crowd that Nixie describes wasn't a mob of book burners at all. They were Alexandrian citizens watching Roman soldiers who were sent by the civic prefect besieging a fortified compound of religious terrorists.
Totally different scenario.
The standoff paralyzed the city for weeks. Ultimately, the Emperor Theodosius had to actually intervene by decree. He ordered the lives of the pagan hostage-takers to be spared to prevent a massive bloodbath, but he ordered the temple itself to be completely dismantled so it could never be used as a military fortress ever again.
And what about the library? The empty shelves that Gibbon was weeping over.
O'Neill points out that the library didn't exist in 392 AD. Not a single ancient source, not even the furious pagan writers who vehemently condemn the destruction of the temple, mentions a library being burned or books being destroyed.
So where did that come from?
Well, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing decades before the siege even took place, referred to the libraries of the Serapium in the past tense.
Oh, wow.
The texts had already been moved, lost, or degraded long before the Christians breached the walls. Gibbon's image of the empty shelves was entirely a product of his 18th century imagination, which Nixie then presents to the modern reader as historical fact.
So the Serapium was a counterterrorism operation against a fortified stronghold, not a book-burning riot.
Exactly.
Okay, that leaves the second major set piece. The horrific murder of Hypatia in 415 AD.
Yes.
Hypatia was this brilliant female mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher in Alexandria. Nixie portrays her as the ultimate martyr for science. In her telling, Hypatia is murdered by a mob of Christians simply because they hated her intellect and her classical learning. Nixie provides this incredibly gruesome detail, describing Hypatia being dragged into a church and flayed alive using broken pottery.
The murder of Hypatia is a genuine, horrific historical tragedy. But how the story has been weaponized over the centuries is deeply complex.
I can imagine.
O'Neill relies on modern specialists, specifically Maria Jilska and Edward J. Watts, who have written definitive, deeply researched biographies of Hypatia. Their research fundamentally breaks the whole science versus religion framing.
How so?
Hypatia was not hated by Christians for her learning. Quite the opposite. She was highly respected by the Christian elite in Alexandria.
I was struggling to reconcile this when reading O'Neill's piece. If she's supposedly this martyr for pagan science, why did the sources point out she actually had Christian bishops as her own devoted students?
Right, it doesn't fit.
That completely breaks the religious war narrative.
Right.
So what was the actual motive? Was this just random mob violence, or was there a specific target on her back?
It was a targeted political assassination. Alexandria in 415 AD was a deeply volatile city experiencing a bitter secular power struggle. You had the Roman civic governor, Orestes, engaged in a turf war with the newly appointed Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril.
Okay.
Hypatia was a highly influential, highly visible political advisor to Orestes. Cyril's political faction needed to isolate the governor, so they started a rumor that Hypatia was using witchcraft to control Orestes and keep him from reconciling with the bishop.
Okay, let's explain the witchcraft accusation for a second. Because to a modern listener, witchcraft sounds like a purely religious, superstitious charge.
Sure.
But in the Roman political world, an accusation of magic was incredibly dangerous legally.
Yes, extremely. In the Roman legal framework, magic wasn't just spooky superstition. It was viewed as highly illegal, treasonous hacking of the universe.
Treason?
Yes. If you were accused of magic, You were accused of manipulating the political order through illicit means. It was a standard political smear used to destroy rivals. Cyril's supporters used this rumor to whip up a mob, ambush her carriage, murder her, and burn her body. It was a brutal political hit designed to weaken the governor, not a religious crusade against mathematics.
I have to stop you there, though, because the detail that really stuck with me from Nixie's book was the flaying. She claims Hypatia was flayed alive with broken pottery. Did O'Neill's sources corroborate that, or is that another exaggeration?
O'Neill traces that specific sadistic imagery straight back to a mistranslation by Edward Gibbon.
Gibbon again.
Always Gibbon. The original Greek source states she was killed with ostraca. Gibbon translated this as potsherds, so broken pottery, and from there he inferred she was flayed or scraped to death.
Okay.
But in the context of Alexandrian riots, ostraca typically referred to the corrugated clay roof tiles used on local buildings, which looked a bit like oyster shells. Roof tiles were the standard, easily accessible projectile of choice for a mob.
So she was stoned.
She was almost certainly stoned to death with roof tiles. It is still a horrific, brutal murder, but the specific imagery of being systematically flayed alive with pottery was a later embellishment that heightened the perceived savagery of the Christians.
And what about the claims Nixie makes about her actually practicing magic with astrolabes?
That detail comes from a writer named John of Nixey, writing over 200 years after the murder took place.
200 years?
Yes. And John of Nixey was a pro-Cyril partisan. He was trying to retrospectively justify the assassination of a respected philosopher, so he invented the detail that she was using satanic magic to beguile the governor.
He was doing PR.
Exactly. Modern historians completely dismiss John of Nixey's additions as political propaganda, but Nixey uncritically accepts them because they fit the narrative that Christians viewed her science as demonic.
Which highlights the danger of selective curation. If you write a history that heavily spotlights the political violence committed by Christians, like the murder of Hypatia, but you completely omit the violence committed by pagans, like the hostage-taking and crucifixions at the Serapium, you aren't giving the reader the truth.
No.
You are building an emotional polemic. Late antiquity was a bloody, cutthroat era for everyone involved.
Precisely. And this brings us to the most vital question of intellectual survival. If the violence was largely localized and political, and the temples mostly died of economic starvation, that leaves the biggest charge Nixie makes.
The books.
The books. We are told the early Christians actively hated classical learning. If they weren't burning libraries at sword point, how did we lose so much ancient literature?
Well, Nixie makes a very strong case that Christians wanted to replace all secular knowledge with blind faith. She prominently quotes the early Christian theologian Tertullian, who famously asked, quote, "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church?"
Classic quote.
Right. And she uses Tertullian to argue that any texts contradicting Christian dogma like Aristotle asserting the universe was eternal, which obviously contradicts the Genesis creation story, were systematically suppressed.
And Nixie is correct that there was a fierce debate within early Christianity about how to handle pagan literature. Tertullian represents the hardline, isolationist wing of that debate. But what Nixie fails to mention to her readers is that Tertullian's side lost.
They lost the debate completely.
Comprehensively. The counter-narrative, which O'Neill details, shows that the intellectual heavyweights of early Christianity thinkers like Origen and Clement of Alexandria argued forcefully that Greek philosophy was incredibly valuable.
They defended it.
Clement actually argued that philosophy was a special divine gift given to the Greeks, serving as a necessary stepping stone to prepare the intellectual world for Christianity.
Origen used a great metaphor for this, right? The spoiling of the Egyptians.
Yes. Origen referenced the Exodus story, where the Israelites took the gold and silver from the Egyptians when they fled. He argued that Christians should take the gold of Greek philosophy, so the logic, the geometry, the astronomy, and weaponize it for their own theological purposes.
Reclaim it.
Exactly. This became the foundational concept of Philosophia Ancilla Theologiae philosophy as the handmaiden to theology. Because the pro-philosophy side won this debate, Christian scholars didn't launch a campaign to suppress pagan learning. They actively preserved it.
O'Neill points out the sheer glaring irony here. If the Christians successfully destroyed all the classical literature, how is Catherine Nixey able to read Ovid, Aristotle, and Plato today?
That's a great point.
Every single scrap of classical literature we have, from Plato's highest dialogues to the smutty secular poems of Catullus, only survives because generations of medieval Christian monks believed it was worth preserving.
This raises an important question. We have to understand the physical and economic reality of preserving a book before the printing press. It wasn't just hitting save on a hard drive.
Not at all.
Copying a book by hand took months of intense physical labor in freezing scriptoriums. It required massive resources. You needed a flock of sheep to create enough parchment or vellum for a single volume.
Just for one book.
The monks had to scrape the skins, mix the iron gall ink, and copy thousands of pages by hand. They did this for pagan texts because they valued the grammar, the rhetoric, and the intellectual challenge.
But surely they suppressed the stuff that directly attacked their worldview. I mean, Nixie claims Aristotle was suppressed because of his views on the eternal universe.
That is demonstrably false. Aristotle was copied extensively by Christian scribes in the Greek-speaking East. His works were preserved, eventually passed to Islamic scholars, and then reintroduced to the medieval Christian West, where they became the absolute foundation of European intellectual life.
Wow.
Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian theologians in history, built his entire systematic theology squarely on the logic of Aristotle, a pagan philosopher. They didn't suppress him, they synthesized him.
O'Neill brings up the Roman poet Lucretius as the ultimate proof of this. Lucretius wrote De Rerum Natura. He was an Epicurean who argued for an atomist, materialist universe where the gods don't care about humanity and there is absolutely no afterlife.
Pretty radical.
It is a deeply, fundamentally anti-Christian worldview.
Yep.
Yet his work survives.
It survives in multiple medieval monastic manuscripts. Copies were found in the monastic libraries of Reichenau, St. Gall, Bobbio, and Corbie. If the church had a systematic policy of hunting down and destroying books they disagreed with, Lucretius would have been priority number one.
They would have burned it instantly.
But the monks preserved him because his poetry was magnificent.
Okay, I hear that, but it still begs the question. If the Christians didn't burn the books, why did we lose so much? We know we only have a tiny fraction of what was written in antiquity. We are missing lost plays of Sophocles, lost books of Livy's history. Where did they go?
The transmission of knowledge in antiquity was incredibly fragile. Books were written on papyrus, which rots in damp climates. Parchment gets eaten by mice or mold. Libraries burned down accidentally.
Just natural decay.
But primarily, the loss of classical texts was an economic catastrophe. As the Western Roman Empire fragmented politically and the sophisticated trade networks collapsed, the vast wealth required to sustain an elite class of secular scribes just vanished.
The money ran out.
There simply wasn't the infrastructure to copy every book. Monasteries became the only institutions with the time, literacy, and resources to preserve knowledge. They naturally prioritized the texts they found most useful, and many obscure or less popular texts simply rotted away. The loss of antiquity was a tragedy of time and economics, not a systematic religious bonfire.
But Nixie has one more piece of evidence regarding the suppression of thought. She makes a massive deal out of the closing of the academy in Athens in 529 AD by the Christian Emperor Justinian. She frames this as the final nail in the coffin, the exact moment a dark age descended on Europe, as Christian law forced the last true philosophers to flee to Persia.
Once again, pulling back the lens to see the historical context ruins the simplistic narrative. First, this wasn't Plato's original academy. That institution had ceased to exist centuries earlier.
Oh, really?
Yes. This was a specific Neoplatonist school established in the 4th century. Second, Justinian didn't issue a blanket ban on all philosophy. He issued a law forbidding pagans from receiving state funding to teach.
So it's a defunding of a public institution, not a ban on the ideas themselves.
Exactly. And it specifically targeted the school led by a philosopher named Damascus. Damascus was part of the Iamblican school of Neoplatonism. Unlike other philosophical schools that just debated metaphysics, the Iamblicans actively practiced theurgy.
And as we established with Hypatia, theurgy, magical rituals meant to commune with the gods, was viewed as highly illegal and dangerous by the state.
Roman emperors were perpetually paranoid about secretive magical rituals, fearing they were being used to divine the emperor's death or plot treason. So Justinian cut their state funding.
And they fled to Persia.
They did, seeking an enlightened philosopher king in the Persian ruler Khosrow I. But as O'Neill notes, and Nixie quickly glosses over, their time in Persia was a complete disaster.
It's no well.
No, they found the Persian court intolerable, the customs alien, and Khosrow deeply disappointing as a philosopher. So they begged to return home. And the supposedly tyrannical, anti-intellectual Christian Emperor Justinian allowed them to return, live in peace, and continue teaching privately.
Unbelievable.
It wasn't the end of philosophy. It was a localized dispute over state funding for a specific politically suspicious sect.
It's incredible how completely different the history looks when you add the political and economic mechanisms back in. Which leads us to the final piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
We need to look at who is praising Nixie's book and who is tearing it down. Because looking at the reception data from bookmarks and the broader critical landscape, there is a very stark divide.
It reveals a great deal about how history is consumed in the modern world. On one side, you have generalists, journalists, and scientists, people like the popular historian Dan Snow, the physicist Lawrence Krauss, and the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins.
Very famous names.
They offer glowing, completely uncritical praise for Nixie's book.
But when you look at the specialists, the academics who actually read Latin and Greek, who excavate the sites, who study late antiquity and medieval history for a living, the reaction is overwhelmingly negative.
Extremely negative. Dame Avril Cameron, one of the most esteemed historians of late antiquity in the world, panned the book as a travesty, calling it overstated and unbalanced. Medievalist Levi Roach criticized it for resurrecting the long-debunked view of the Middle Ages as a period of blind faith and intellectual stagnation. Oxford classicist Peter Thoneman pointed out the nifty footwork Nixie uses to misrepresent her sources. O'Neill points to scholars like Edward J. Watts and James J. O'Donnell as the gold standard for this era, historians who wrote nuanced history without relying on simplistic hero and villain archetypes.
It's a classic case of the halo effect. It's like asking a brilliant heart surgeon to rebuild the transmission on your car. Just because someone is a genius in evolutionary biology like Richard Dawkins or a brilliant physicist like Lawrence Krauss doesn't mean they have any specialized knowledge of 4th century Roman imperial decrees or the translation history of the word ostraka or the archaeological footprint of temple desecration in the Levant.
Exactly.
Why do we trust generalists over specialists when it comes to specific historical eras?
We trust them because Nixie's narrative feeds a massive modern ideological appetite. Many people today want to believe the conflict thesis. They want to believe that religion and science are locked in an eternal zero-sum war.
It feels relevant to them.
It maps perfectly onto our contemporary cultural and political anxieties. If you are frustrated by modern religious fundamentalism encroaching on science education or public policy today, a book that tells you that Christians have always been anti-intellectual book burners feels incredibly validating.
It's comforting.
It feels true to your modern experience, even if the ancient historical evidence directly contradicts it.
It confirms our biases with a comforting historical fable.
Yes, but good history isn't supposed to simply confirm our modern prejudices. Good history should make us wiser. It should force us to grapple with the past on its own terms, not use it as a convenient mirror for our current political grievances. The transition from the classical world to the Christianized Roman Empire was an incredibly complex process.
A slow evolution.
It involved profound social, economic, and cultural shifts over centuries. To reduce it to a cartoonish fable of enlightened pagans and barbaric Christians robs the past of its humanity, and it robs us of the chance to actually understand how civilizations evolve.
That is a really powerful summation. So to recap the journey we've taken through these sources today, we started with the explosive cinematic claims of Catherine Nixey's The Darkening Age. The idea that Christian fanatics systematically destroyed classical culture.
Right.
But then we held those claims up against the hard archaeological data, the economic realities of the ancient world, and the textual evidence provided by critical specialists like Tim O'Neill. We saw how Nixie selectively curated evidence, omitted crucial context like the pagan hostage takers at the Serapium, and relied heavily on the outdated biases of 18th century writers like Edward Gibbon.
We saw that the messy, violent, and deeply complex reality of late antiquity vigorously resists simple narratives. The Romans were not peaceful pluralists. They violently enforced political conformity.
And the Christians were not monolithic.
No, they were not anti-intellectual barbarians. They actively synthesized and preserved the classical knowledge we still rely on today.
And before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about how our view of the past is so easily shaped by the stories we want to be true today. We project our modern anxieties about religion, science, and tolerance backward onto the Romans and the early Christians, twisting their reality to fit our current debates.
Which forces us to ask a rather uncomfortable question about ourselves. If we are so prone to projecting our modern blind spots backward, what are we currently projecting onto the future?
It's fascinating to think about. When historians look back at our era in 1,000 years, Will they judge us by our loudest, most extreme voices? Will they write sweeping, simplistic polemics that flatten our highly complex society into a neat binary struggle between absolute good and absolute evil? Or will they have the patience to dig through the digital rubble, look past the prevailing cultural narratives of our time, and find the nuanced, messy, contradictory truth of who we really were? Because as we've seen today, the historical lens is often clouded by our own reflections. The truth is rarely as simple as broken statues or empty shelves.